The hearing will come to order. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to this interesting hearing today, American Decline or Renewal, Globalizing Jobs and Technology. The jurisdiction for oversight is more indulgent than the jurisdiction the committee has for legislation. If this committee tried to claim jurisdiction for legislation coming out of any discussions today, we probably would be in a death struggle with other committees that would probably win that struggle. But part of our jurisdiction is to consider American competitiveness generally. There are several items in our jurisdiction that gives us that broad an authority at least to think about how American business needs to be more competitive, and much of the committee's work in the last 2 years has been on that subject. And certainly this hearing today gets at that subject as well. The former Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Alan Blinder, observed, "What I've learned is anyone who says anything that obliquely sounds hostile to free trade is treated as an apostate." Actually, that apostasy is very welcome in parts of my district that has suffered a great deal of job loss in the last decade and the last generation. But the faith that Blinder has recently begun to question himself has guided both our policy and international economic policy for more than 2 decades. Its credo is that lowering trade barriers while curbing regulation produces the greatest growth. According to the doctrine, this new order would provide undiluted benefits to an advanced nation like ours. It would free Americans trapped in traditional jobs for more sophisticated remunerative work, while flooding the world with goods and services made in the United States. I represent a lot of folks who do not feel they were trapped in traditional jobs, but really wish they still had those jobs. But for 15 years after the ratification of NAFTA and 13 years after the birth of the WTO, the ranks of the doubters seems to be growing. Could this reflect America's net loss of 3.5 million manufacturing jobs since 2001? Many workers have been freed from being trapped in traditional jobs, but have not found other jobs that are as well paid or as easy to support themselves and a family on as the jobs that they lost. Could it reflect the fact that the United States merchandise trade deficit has risen every year but one over the last decade and has hovered around $750 billion for 3 years running? Our trade surplus in services is tiny by comparison. In 2007, it was only around 1/8 of the goods deficit's size. Could it reflect the nation's assumption since 2001 of the $10 trillion in new debt, $6.5 trillion by households, $3.5 trillion by the federal government? Is that an indication that we have not produced anywhere near the level at which we would like to consume? Could it reflect anxiety over the rise of colossal sovereign wealth funds that are using what they take from us to buy up our industrial and financial assets? In this context, the hardships of working Americans are proving longer lasting and are deeper. Lawrence Summers, the Secretary of Treasury, the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, and a strong supporter of globalization in the past, and before that, the chief economist of the World Bank, last month wrote of a world where Americans can legitimately doubt whether the success of the global economy is good for them. He also acknowledged that growth in the global economy encourages the development of stateless elites whose allegiance is to global economic success and their own prosperity, rather than the interests of the nation where they are headquartered. Even when folks like Summers, one of the architects of the current international trading system, is now feeling and saying out loud concerns like that, it heralds a significant change in the public debate on the global economy and the values of the global economy to American workers. No longer can we, in good conscience, avoid the question, what are we to do about it? If we were to find effective answers, we must be open to new ideas, even ideas that might have seemed apostasy in the past. We must be prepared to discover that we know less than we thought about the consequences of globalization, or even that some of our basic views on the subject may rest on mistaken assumptions. The panelists in the first panel today point out that much of our economic theory is built on a society in which the baker sells his bread to the candlestick maker, who sells his candles to the miller, who sells his flour to the baker. And with the kind of size, the kind of capital, the kind of labor force required for the economy today, that may not be the best model. It may not be one that truly describes the economy of the world that exists now. We have two panels, each of which will, in its own way, in different ways, help us consider these apostate ideas. The first panel will offer their perspectives on the belief that we have had for several generations that the design and governance of our world trading system, as well as our expectations of proper behavior by corporations. One of the members of the panel, Dr. Ralph Gomory, last year testified before the Science and Technology Committee that the interests of U.S.-based multinational corporations are no longer necessarily in step with those of a healthy American economy. Today, certainly an apostate idea. Today, the members of this panel will question things we think we know about the role and responsibilities of corporations, about the relationship of the state and the market, about the ability of technological innovation to ensure our country's economic prosperity in the absence of changes in the trading system. And they will suggest some measures that might strengthen America for the future. The second panel is testimony from the trenches. Two heads of domestic companies will talk about their commitment to producing at home, what they do out of concern for the well-being of their employees, the viability of the communities in which their businesses are located, the sustainability of the nation's economy. They will tell us about the cost of upholding that commitment under the current trading system and suggest how the federal government might help lighten their burdens now. Joining them is a regional development expert who will explain what it takes to attract an investment as the lure of offshoring becomes more prevalent, and will add some ideas of his own about how to improve American competitiveness. I will yield back the balance of my time, which expired a long time ago, and recognize now the distinguished ranking member, not Mr. Sensenbrenner, but Mr. Hall, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and you've very adequately given an opening statement that covers, I think, everything that ought to be covered. And I am not here to take Mr. Sensenbrenner's place. I'm just here to carry out the bylaws that there has to be a minority here before we can hit that gavel down. We get started hearing your testimony, but don't be alarmed that for the lack of members that are here. And Mr. Sensenbrenner's not here because he fell yesterday, and the good news is that he was badly injured. Was not badly injured. He's all right, and he'll be back with us shortly. But all the empty seats, most all of us have about 3 to 4 things to do every hour of the day here. And your testimony under the chairman's guidance is taken down. It's even being televised, and everybody in the Congress will read it and see it. So you're not talking to empty chairs. You have the most important people, staffers back here, that tell us what you said, when we get back to our offices. But I won't even be here very long, but I have great admiration for the chairman, and I know he's going to handle it well. I yield back my time, but I have asked unanimous consent to put my opening statement in the record.
Certainly without objection. I hope the members did not really believe that every member of Congress is going to read the transcript of today's hearings, but I do still think, even if a relatively small number of people even learn in the most general terms what was discussed, that it will advance the debate and allow us to consider these questions in ways we haven't before but need to. And I ask unanimous consent that all additional opening statements submitted by any member be included in the record. And without objection, it is so ordered. It is now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses today. The first is Dr. Ralph Gomory, who currently serves both as a research professor at the NYU Stern School of Business and as president emeritus of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Dr. Margaret Blair is a PhD economist who serves as professor at law at Vanderbilt University School of Law. Dr. Bruce Scott is the Paul Whiton Cherington Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. You will each have 5 minutes for your oral testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you complete your testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. It is the practice, this is an investigations and oversight subcommittee. It is our practice to take testimony under oath. The likelihood of a perjury prosecution coming out of this hearing seems remote, but we do still take testimony under oath. Do any of you object to being sworn? All right, and you also are allowed counsel if you prefer. We ask you these questions to put you at ease.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Johnson.
Pardon me for breaking in, but I have a markup starting at 10:30.
Yes, ma'am.
And I noticed on the witness list here there's someone from our area, the president and CEO of Arlington Chamber of Commerce, and I simply want to welcome him and then reiterate Mr. Hall's comment about us getting the information he was not here, but I do have a markup. And
all right, thank Ms. Johnson, would you like to introduce, he is on the second panel, but if you'd like to introduce him now, that would be fine.
I don't even know him. There he is.
All right, well, thank you. I'll be pleased to welcome him for you and for the rest of the panel, and I hope you wish you well at your markup. And none of you have counsel. All right, if you now all rise and raise your right hand. Do any of you, do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Thank you. The record will reflect that all answered that they did so swear. Dr. Gomory, you may begin. All right, you do need to turn on your microphone.
I'm sorry. I'm here just representing myself, not the Sloan Foundation, not New York University. But for myself, let me say how pleased I am to have this opportunity to discuss these crucial issues, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for having organized this hearing. I will make only one basic point in my testimony, and that is that in this era of globalization, the interests of global corporations and their countries have diverged. And if most Americans are to benefit from globalization, we must change this situation, and there are ways to do that. Okay? After all, what is it that companies want of their corporations? I'd say two things. One, countries have looked to their corporations to be productive at making what they make, and second, to enable the people of the country to earn a living by being a part of these productive organizations. Now, if we look at the behavior of corporations, it's clear that profit is something that really matters to corporations. But globalization has now made it possible for global corporations to pursue their profits by building capabilities abroad. And instead of investing alongside U.S. workers and using that investment in R&D and all the rest to increase their productivity, corporations today can produce goods and services abroad using low-cost labor and import those goods and services into the United States. But in creating their profits this way, they are not fulfilling the social purpose of allowing Americans to participate in the production of goods. Economists correctly point out that this often results in the availability of cheaper goods, and that itself is a social good. And that is certainly true. But it is also true that as we lose our capabilities in many areas, we have less to trade for those goods, so that eventually the cheaper goods become expensive in real terms, and you come out behind, not ahead. The idea that the industrial development of your trading partner can actually become harmful to total GDP, has appeared in the economic literature from time to time. With the detailed understanding that Professor Belmore and I have added to that viewpoint in our book, there's a good reason to think that the rapid industrialization of some Asian countries is harmful to the United States overall, not just in some areas. Now let me say that U.S. corporations were not always purely profit-oriented. When Reginald Jones became the CEO of General Electric in 1972, he announced that his responsibilities would be equally split among the company and its shareholders, its employees, the American industry, and the nation. And that sense of broad responsibility was at that time, and I remember it myself, pervasive in American industry. But in the years since then, that view of corporate leadership has been largely replaced by the idea that the business of business is solely to make profit for shareholders, and that in the pursuit of profits or shareholder value, all other values should be sacrificed. And what has been the result of that? During the 3 decades after 1973, GDP increased steadily as new technologies were introduced that increased productivity. But during this period, the gains from this increase were distributed in a very skewed fashion. Over those 30 years, most Americans have seen little or no growth in real wages. The gains from this impressive productivity growth have been going to the wealthy, and even among them to the very wealthy, primarily. While many explanations have been brought forward for this remarkable divergence of the richer and poorer in our country, one very simple one has received little attention. But let's note that the shares of corporations are held overwhelmingly by those who are already wealthy. 90% shares are held by the top 20%, or by those, like top executives, who will become wealthy if share values go up. And if corporations focus on share value to the exclusion of anything else, this is an automatic mechanism for increasing inequality and this skewed distribution. But with the onset of globalization, the capital, know-how, and technology that once made American workers the most productive in the world are being transferred overseas to other workers who will do the same job for a fraction of the wage. This makes for excellent corporate profits, but it leaves American workers out, and it will leave most Americans as losers, not winners, from globalization. Can anything be done about this? The answer is yes, but we will have to do some new things. While the U.S. has no stated national strategy aimed at the goal of greater GDP, there's no lack of individual suggestions about ways to improve the U.S. economic situation. This often translates into asking for improved K-12 education, etc., 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 and I discuss all these in my written testimony. However, the main thrust of this testimony today is on the issue of better aligning corporate and national goals. We need to consider a U.S. economic strategy that provides incentives to companies to have high value-added jobs in the United States. If we want high value-added jobs, let us reward companies for having such jobs. Let us consider a corporate income tax that does that. And whether we don't care how they do it, whether it's through R&D, advanced technology, or by just plain American ingenuity exercised at every level. Such a tax could be revenue neutral, low on producers and high on the non-producers. Such a tax would encourage corporations to return to what a country wants of them: high output and jobs in this country. Many people would oppose this or any similar move saying that our national economic strategy is and should be to leave markets alone and take whatever free markets produce. But when you think for 1 second, you will realize there is no one free market. All markets are affected by all our regulations and our tax structures. And so the question simply remains, which free market are you describing, and which free market do you want? However, we cannot do these things that I have described, or anything effective, if we do not balance trade. If we do not balance trade, we cannot be in control of our own destiny. We will continue to be the victims of mercantilist practices, and there is nothing to prevent U.S. corporations from leaving the country and working from abroad if they prefer that to what it means to be a U.S. corporation. But trade can be balanced. There are many approaches to this, but in this limited time, I would only mention one, a remarkable approach described by Warren Buffett and based on what he calls import certificates. If most Americans are to benefit rather than lose, let me summarize. If most Americans are to benefit rather than lose from globalization, we need to realign the goals of corporations with those of the nation, and we must balance trade to control our own destiny. And there are ways to do both these things. Let us start now.
Dr. Blair.
Thank you. I knew to turn his on. I just didn't know to turn mine on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak to your committee today. I'm Dr. Margaret Mendenhall Blair. I'm an economist, and I'm also a professor of law at Vanderbilt University Law School. And I specialize in corporate law, corporate finance, and corporate governance. And what I want to speak to you today about is a question that has to do with the fiduciary obligations that corporate directors have by law in this country. In particular, I want to address a claim that is often made in the press and by members of what a Delaware court judge has recently called the corporate governance industry. This is the claim that corporate directors have a legal duty to maximize share value, or maximize profits, if you want to think of it in those terms. What I hope you will take from my testimony today is that this claim is at best a misleading overstatement, and at worst this claim is false. But it is often asserted as a weapon to try to persuade corporate managers and directors that they should take actions that benefit a particular group of shareholders of a given corporation, regardless of whether those actions may impose high costs on creditors, employees, the communities where the corporations operate, or other stakeholders, or sometimes even on the long-run ability of the corporation itself to compete effectively for market share or to develop the next technology. Let me begin with an indisputable legal fact. There is no statutory requirement in the U.S. that corporations must maximize profits or that directors are responsible for maximizing share value. The Model Business Corporation Act, Section 3.01, says simply, every corporation has the purpose of engaging in any lawful business unless a more limited purpose is set forth in the Articles of Incorporation. That's it. That's all it says about what the goal of corporations is. Delaware corporate law just says that a corporation, quote, may be organized under this chapter to conduct or promote any lawful business or purpose. State statutes assign all powers to act for a corporation to its board of directors, but do not in any way prescribe how directors are to carry out this task. Case law, which in the U.S. is mostly made in the courts of the state of Delaware, also does not require share value maximization, except in one very narrow circumstance. When in the course of buyout negotiations, it becomes inevitable that a corporation will be sold, the Delaware Supreme Court has said that directors' duties then change quote, from defenders of the corporate bastion to auctioneers charged with getting the best price for stockholders at a sale of the company, close quote. Note that implicitly, at least, this formulation of the law accepts the proposition that directors may, in all other circumstances, act to preserve the long-run viability of the corporation itself, even if other actions might be more immediately rewarding to shareholders. To be sure, courts often note that directors have a duty to act in the best interest of, quote, the corporation and its shareholders, close quote. In theory and sometimes in practice, these interests coincide with one another, but not always. For this reason, courts have always interpreted the mandate to act in the best interest of the corporation and its shareholders very broadly, to give directors wide discretion. Moreover, in applying this mandate, courts implicitly or explicitly recognize that the corporation is a separate entity from its shareholders and that directors' duties normally run to the corporation first. Courts recognize that directors and managers must have very broad discretion to balance competing interests in a business enterprise because business decisions are often very complex. Courts further recognize that they should not be making business decisions for directors or interfering in the actions that directors take in good faith. This legal doctrine is called the business judgment rule. What this means is that directors are very rarely found in breach of their duties unless they engage in blatantly self-dealing behavior. Now, I by no means mean to suggest today that in today's world, corporate directors and managers are not under significant pressure to find ways to increase share value, sometimes even at the expense of the long-run performance of the company. But let me be clear that this pressure comes from the media, from shareholder advocates, from financial institutions in whose direct interest it is for the company to get its share price to go up, and from a self-imposed pressure created by compensation packages that provide enormous potential rewards for directors and managers if stock price goes up. And by the way, those compensation packages also impose very little downside cost on the managers or directors if in their attempt to goose the company to get share price to go up, it should not work out and the stock price declines. This means that managers and directors often have huge incentives to cause their companies to take very big risks in their effort to achieve higher share prices. These pressures might be alleviated with certain policy actions that this body and or other regulatory bodies could, in theory, take. In Britain, for example, the British Companies Act of 2006 explicitly codified what most lawmakers believed had already been the rule under case law in Britain, and it provides that directors have duties to multiple stakeholders. A change in the tax rules, for another example, might reduce the current tax preference given to compensation packages that are based on stock options, and that makes those stock options so much more attractive than other forms of compensation. In sum, decisions by managers and directors of U.S. corporations to choose investment strategies that may be profitable in the short run, but that sell our country short by moving value-creating activities offshore, are decisions that those managers and directors must take personal responsibility for. These decisions are not in any way mandated by law.
Dr. Blair. Dr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I teach at a business school and started my studies looking at how firms are managed and doing case writing here and in Europe, and switched from that to looking at those same ideas at the level of countries and saying countries have strategies as well. This has been a very lonely thing to be doing for the last 20 years. It really has. It's been completely out of touch with what's going on in most of organized economics. It's very strange to see this beginning to be used as a set of terms and saying we have to think about it differently. Having said that, what I'd like to say to you is that if you think about this problem in terms of globalization, you're never going to get there. Globalization means you're integrating the markets. That's all. There's another way to look at it, which is how the countries are managed, which has something to do with what you people on this committee do all the time. And the operational way to think about this is in terms of the governance systems that operate within all the countries. Capitalism is a system of governance for economic affairs. Democracy is the one that almost everybody uses for the political affairs, but you got two governance systems that are working together that influence each other all through this. And you need to begin to pick that up, I think, as a way to see what you can do. It's very hard to do this, and certainly teaching at a business school, most people simply turn off and say, it's too hard to do this, I can't figure out how the pieces fit together. So let me suggest there is a way to think about this that's simple enough that anybody can catch it very quickly. The analogy is that organized competition in all the major sports is organized the same way a capitalist system is in a country. It's a three-level system that starts with a political authority. It depends upon which one of those sports you like, but if it's football, it's the NFL. If it's baseball, it's operate as a political authority. So that they can operate as a state. I'm sorry. Okay. So that they can operate as a state. Now, every one of these has the power to create the rules. They decide who gets hired as the regulators and referees. So you have a set of institutions, the rules, the regulations, everything, which is exactly the same as a capitalist system. I had somebody I was talking with a couple of weeks ago about this, who's a Canadian banker, and who said, well, I'm really uncomfortable about this notion of regulation. I asked, well, do you watch hockey? Yeah, of course I watch hockey. How would it work if you had no referees? Unimaginable. Well, it's the same thing. You can't, and if you're on financial services, Mr. Chairman, you must have had at least the chance to think about what happens when we have the number one regulator in the financial services sector say, I really think the private sector can do it without government. That's how we got to where we are. Football would work that way. Hockey would work that way. All of them would work that way if you don't have the rules, the referees, and most of what we focus on is the games. The games and the sports correspond to the markets that you see in the capitalism. So if I turn from the sports to the capitalism, you just say, look, it's the same three levels. You have a government, that's you in this, the rules, and then the market framework. And thinking about it this way gives you something that's easy to work with. If you've ever watched football, you've got to recognize that, and especially for the men, you end up saying, I've got to watch till the last 2 minutes. You can't tell who's going to win. Yeah, but that's basically because the National Football League organized and said we're going to split the television revenues equally. Green Bay is going to have the same television revenues as Los Angeles or Boston or anybody else. We're going to equalize the revenues. Our function is close games. Close games get people watching until the last of the game, and that's what sells the advertising revenue. If I go to baseball, they have not had that. You have teams that have 5-6 times the revenue of other teams. Football decided that entertainment was best when the games were close. The purpose of a capitalist system is very different, but the governance process is just exactly, this three-level governance system works as a way to understand it. Most of our attention, I think, and in the descriptions of how capitalism works, is built around the product markets. That's the part we see. And that's the fruit stand, the automobile dealership, whatever else. The really decisive things that distinguish one country from another are not in the product markets, they're in the factor markets, meaning how do you deal with land, how do you deal with labor, how do you deal with financial capital, how do you deal with intellectual property. And unlike the simple-minded models that are used so much of the time where we assume that we've got voluntary transactions among people that are consenting adults that have equal information, there's virtually no way to get equal relations in the factor markets. You're dealing with unequal power as well as unequal information. All you have to do is think about somebody going to apply for a job. The organization that you're applying to may be 100 people, it may be 1,000 people, it may be 100,000 people. There just aren't equal relationships in there. You have to have rules and regulations of how these things work to make it at all a plausible thing in a democratic society. Can be done. That's not the problem. The problem is recognizing the fact that we're not dealing with equal relationships, and especially not in the factor markets. Now, let me take this particularly. I was thinking just what you're talking about with the competition and the model of it. Look, I've just put this is a really homely little chart. A model of unregulated competition has existed for a long time. The Brits had it in the Middle Ages. It's the common pasture, all right? And just imagine we've got a bunch of poor people that live in those little brown houses to the side of it, and we've got one big house. And so the castle there has got his grounds. The other folks don't have much, but the other folks share the common. They can take their goats or their cattle or whatever they are onto the common, and if it's an unrestricted system, what happens is you keep on adding cattle until you destroy the common. And people understood that the way to do this was, in the British case, what they did was say, let's privatize, all right, and then we're going to have somebody in control, and we won't have the excessive usage. In addition, we'll have people that will invest money to improve it, to drain it, to change what we do from one crop to another. Well, this is a useful thing to think about, because there really are several ways to deal with this. But the easiest one to think about it is that's not an insoluble problem at all. All you got to do is have a fence around the common, have a gate, and have somebody at the gate. Now, if the somebody at the gate is a legitimate gatekeeper, he can just say, look, you're on Mondays and Wednesdays, and your staff is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and this is all you can have. Right? But you got to have either legitimacy or you got to have coercive power to manage the gate. Well, much the same thing is true, and when you're thinking about your global economy, that's exactly what the circumstances are. The biggest of the common resources is not the land for the grass. It's the savings of a society. It's the technologies of a society, and in my sense, above all, it's the legal frameworks that are effectively the collective capital of the capitalist system. Now, just take as an example, a country that joins Western Europe at this stage, the EU. If you ask, what are the terms of joining? The terms of joining are, you must accept the whole framework. And the whole framework used to mean a few hundred pages, then a few thousand pages. Now, a new member that joins Europe has to sign on for 100,000 pages of regulation, and there's no discussion. You either sign up for it or you can't belong. But that's the accumulated wisdom of somebody building this thing up over a period of time. And that's one of the most precious things that they have. If I take this and say, what is it applied to the U.S.? The U.S. was set up in an utterly unusual set of circumstances because the Constitution gave the right to charter firms to the states. So they start off with, in effect, 13 people, 13 organizations that can charter firms to compete in the market. And then the right to regulate the competition was held by the federal government. Well, it very quickly got us into a set of circumstances. As soon as we got a global market here, let's say it's not a global market, as soon as we got the continental market, we began to have abuse of the market just exactly like the folks grazing on the common. And the most obvious abuse turned out to be companies trying to have holding companies and quasi-monopolies. And they were prohibited from doing that by every state until New Jersey changed its law. And in 1888, New Jersey authorizes holding companies, and we have a rush to incorporate in New Jersey, then in New York, and then in Delaware. and you change the whole structure, both of the firms and of competition in the United States, not by act of Congress, but by the vote of a state legislature. Now, Congress tries to come back and find a way to deal with this, and Theodore Roosevelt is the first one that I think really understood what he was doing, saying we're going to have to create something that has a regulatory framework that corresponds to the global market. So they brought back the idea of the federal charter. The federal charter was initially proposed by Madison at the Constitutional Convention, and people decided that if it had been put in the Constitution, the chances were the Constitution would never have been ratified. It would have symbolized too much power in the hands of the federal government. So there was no federal charter. You had initially 13. It's in effect a commons with 13 gates to start with. As you go along, it goes to 30, then 40, then 50. So you have no regulation of who uses it. You have to have a regulatory regime that has oversight over the whole thing, and Roosevelt recognized we didn't have that. And so he and William Howard Taft both proposed for over a period of about 11 years that they either create a federal license or a federal charter, which is the same thing, and they can't get it. They can't get it through. In this, and the hitch is when we got the big companies, we ended up with big companies having enough power to dominate state legislatures. State legislatures were appointing people that were not going to allow the regulation of the firms. All right. How about if I stop there?
That would be fine. I think all the witnesses spoke for more than 5 minutes, but less than 50. So I appreciate the restraint. Oh, Mr. Baird just left. I was going to call upon him. All right. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. If I don't pause to say I now recognize myself for a second round, I think you'll understand I get to keep asking questions nonetheless. Dr. Blair, I was interested in your discussion of the various constituencies and considerations that boards of directors should take into account, not just the financial interest of shareholders. My question is, who shall guard the guardians? How do we hold directors accountable, and on what basis and how are they chosen? If they are elected by shareholders, why would shareholders not elect the members of the board who would do the most to act in their interest, their financial interest?
That's an excellent question. It goes right to the heart of one of the things that has driven what I regard as a cultural change in the last 20 to 25 years to bring directors around to thinking that they have to maximize share value. And that is the argument, well, that if they don't focus on a single metric, we don't have any way of holding them accountable. And my response to that is on several levels. First of all, the notion that if you maximize share value, it's really clear what you have to do is crazy. Nobody knows what you're going to have to do to maximize share value. And so maximizing share value doesn't translate into a specific set of actions that directors are supposed to take. And at any point in time, there's disagreement and contention potentially about whether or not the actions that the board is trying to take serves to maximize share value. My own view of this is that the corporation was formed with the idea in mind that what corporations should do is maximize the total wealth creating capacity, and that would mean that in an economic sense, if the shareholders are made better off, it should not be at the expense of some of the other stakeholders. Now that's that doesn't translate into specific instructions as to what they should do on a day-to-day basis. And I think up until about 25 years ago, the larger corporations, because they were very visible, because they had a brand and an image they had to protect, and because they tended to have loyalties to the companies where they were incorporated, the executives, maybe not perfectly, absolutely not perfectly, but at least they tended to think in terms of that. What are we doing for the long-run health of the company? What are we doing and how is it going to affect the communities where we operate? How is it going to affect our customers? And I think that the emphasis on share value has caused many company directors and and managers to lose sight of that bigger picture. Can you make them do it? Can you force them to do it? Probably not, except that I'm at my second level, but we can't force them to maximize share value either. That's my point. But at a second level, what I'm a strong believer in is disclosure, and I think increasingly we've had a tug and pull in the 1930s after the financial collapse. The Congress moved to put into place a system that would require publicly traded companies to disclose a lot more than they used to. There's still an enormous amount they don't disclose, and I think that if they're required to disclose what it is they're doing on a number of different fronts, they're going to be more responsible about what they do.
I would love to pursue that further, but I will now yield back the balance of my time in the first round of questioning so that Mr. Baird, who I understand also has a markup like Ms. Johnson, may ask questions. Mr. Baird for 5 minutes.
I really am fascinated by the topic of this hearing. I thank the chairman for holding it. Dr. Blair, I thought your testimony was quite enlightening because there's a sense that the fiduciary responsibility obligates the company to just look at sort of short-term profits. And you're saying that's not the case at all. You're saying that is maybe an urban legend or something,
Yes.
but it's not valid. What other incentives and what can or should the government do or not do, and this is not just for Dr. Blair, for all of our panelists, to try to get that longer-term commitment to the well-being not only of just the shareholder in the short term, but the communities in which the businesses operate, the workforce that may have been loyal to a company for 30 or 40 years or more. What kind of reforms can or should we do or not do? And that's to any of the panelists.
I'll start, if that's okay. Well, I think the first and most important thing is that we need to make sure that there are not incentives in place that cause company executives and directors to have this preference for risk and preference for strategies that produce instant profit rather than long-term profit. Now, there was an attempt, in a sense, that's kind of ironic because there was a big push in the 1980s when corporate directors were and managers were under a lot of pressure from the hostile takeover market. Then they began to say, well, if we have executives focus who are compensated in stock or in stock options, they'll focus on share value, and then they'll be less vulnerable to takeovers. And prior to that, they were saying, we have these other responsibilities, and so we don't necessarily think that just because this outsider thinks they can come in and buy the company for more, that we should be required to sell it. And so we fixed that problem by radically changing the way corporate executives were compensated to tie their compensation much more tightly to not just share value, but to the value of the options, which are a one-sided gamble. Okay, and our stock options have a huge tax advantage relative to compensation in shares. I think if directors were paid and managers were paid in restricted stock that they had to hold for 10 years before they could sell it, that would cause them to have very different set of incentives than what they have with the compensation in stock options. That's where I would start. It's a big problem, but I think I'd start there.
Dr. Gomory?
I agree with what Margaret has just said, but I've had, I don't know whether it's 60 or 70 man years on corporate boards, and I have concluded that the people on those boards are humans, right? And they are subject to the normal human emotions and attachments, right? And when this whole business first became visible to me, it was in a world in which the directors wanted their companies to be successful, and they cared quite a bit about the employees. I was an officer of IBM during its golden period, right? Now, I think that they are still humans. But I think there are two problems. One is they believe the thing that Margaret says isn't there, and she's right, which is it isn't their legal duty, they believe it is, to maximize shareholder. The second thing, the compensation being tied to the share price and the sheer volume of shares given to leading executives is such that for most people, that amount of wealth is overwhelming. I agree with Margaret that restricted stock, which goes up and down, not just one way, is a much better vehicle. But I would think that there should be less compensation, honestly, because these people do care about their companies and their people, as anyone does who associates for a long time with them. But they are overwhelmed, in my opinion, by what they see as the legal imperatives, some pressure from some of the totally financially oriented shareholders, and that overwhelms their was in the past their natural instinct to care about their people, their community, and the other things, because they are human too. And I think we have, in some sense, overcome that normal tendency which had existed for decades and decades, right, before the 1980s, by a concerted effort to line them up with very active financial shareholders with these tempting huge packages. I think they should not be there.
Did you want the time back, Mr. Chairman, or I've got more questions, but I'd be happy to give
given that you have a markup and that there's nobody else, why don't you go on?
Terrific. What are what are your thoughts about dealing with golden parachutes and retirement packages for executives? You know, we see increasingly these takeovers and mergers, et cetera, or business decisions that basically drive a company into the dirt, and the employees lose much of their retirement benefits, but the guys at the top walk away with enormous compensation levels. Any merit to tying the fate of employees' benefit packages to the fate of the executive or board packages?
I like it in principle. The devil's going to be in the details, but yeah, I like it in principle.
And I feel exactly the same as Margaret. I think that's a very good direction. I mean, we don't have to have, and we didn't have in the past, corporate executives who were paid hundreds of times more than everyone else, and who had these enormous retirement packages at a time when the pensions of everyone else were being cut. But that's what we have now, and it's a distortion, and I think it's one that we do not need.
You think that could be remedied statutorily, possibly? Yes.
I do. I agree with Margaret. It's not as simple as it sounds, but as a direction, it is the right way to go. Right?
What are there any other incentives driving? One of the issues here is the globalization of jobs in the economy. What are other perverse incentives that you're aware of that may incline a business to export jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs, that they might not want to do, but that inherent structures in our legal code or our tax incentives don't force them, but certainly reward them for doing? Have you identified some of these?
I have not focused on that in my work, and I
Okay.
don't actually have a good answer for you there.
Dr. Scott?
Yeah, we're into a transaction-driven system. Let me back up just 1 second. Executive compensation in this country has no parallel anywhere else. Okay, it's much higher, and if you take a look at this over a period of time, if I just go back to the 70s, the CEOs of our big companies are being paid in the order of 30 times their mean employee. And in Europe, it was about 20. And that's what it was when I went to start doing research in Europe in the 60s. As we get to the end of the 70s, we begin to break away. And when we go through the 80s, we're running out of bounds on this. But the reason for this, I think, is that we created the stock option, and the stock option cost was not a cost on the P&L statement. And in 1992, 3, 4, the Financial Accounting Standards Board said it ought to be, and there was enough pressure brought by people down here to say, if you really try to put that on the P&L statement, we're going to so curtail your budget, you're not going to be able to do anything, right? And Arthur Levitt's written a very interesting account of what happens, and he just simply tells the Financial Accounting Standards Board, if you try to put this on the P&L statement, I will not back you. And the Accounting Standards Board only recommends, it was the SEC decision to say we're going to allow this to continue to go. So you've created a transaction-oriented system where you don't have to pay for it. The cost of the stock options drops directly to the bottom and doesn't have to go through the P&L statement until we get to 2004. So you've given the directors a right to give people free money, and that's what they did. And you can raise your earnings and raise your stock price by doing a deal with the Chinese. You can do it any way you want. It's the transactions that drive the stock and that drive your compensation. It's really a pernicious system.
What do you think we should do about that?
If I were doing it, I would find a way to outlaw the stock option entirely. And that may sound really weird.
I mean, as a mechanism of compensation?
Yes.
Or as a, okay.
Yes. And Margaret mentioned the other alternative. The other alternative is treat the CEO more like a shareholder and say, we're going to give you stock. And when you do that, you have to record a cost. You can't give away stock without, you can give the option. Now you have to put something on it. But you have to give the stock, and if you're getting restricted stock, you can't sell it for a good deal of time. Therefore, if the company has a down on this thing, you take it down along with the shareholders. It's a tremendous change. We've created a set of, this is a big part of your problem over in financial services. And if you go back to Martin Wolf writing about this in the Financial Times back in January, he said, unless this is changed, and unless it's changed by legislation, you're never going to correct this problem. Right? The runaway is creating financial incentives, Margaret mentioned it just briefly, that have an upside that encourages people to take risk and no downside. The downside's paid by the shareholder and the taxpayer, but not by the person taking the risks.
Let me add something to that. So far, we've talked mostly about, let's not have stock options, let's not do this, let's not do that. But I think that we ought to decide what we want a corporation to do, we as a nation. And that might have something to do with where the jobs are and whether they're productive and things like that. And then we ought to make sure that our tax structure rewards that, not just pure profit, because they won't get to keep it if they don't meet certain other criteria, if they're not productive, if they don't treat people right, if their skew of compensation is crazy, right? Why don't we try and incent the corporations to behave in the way we want them to? I think that's worth thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. I want to pursue the corporate governance issues that I had begun with Dr. Blair. This has also been debated, as Dr. Scott suggested, in the Financial Services Committee, and corporate governance issues, specifically in executive compensation. And there are other critics of corporate governance who say that if actually corporations are acting to benefit 20% of the population, the 20% that Dr. Gomory says owns most of the stock, that would be more revolutionary than anything the Bolsheviks did or happened in 1789 in France. That would be a remarkable change, that corporations are not actually even being governed to benefit the shareholders, that corporate boards are made up of CEOs of other corporations, and they all think that they're underpaid, and that they know that the salary or the total compensation for the CEO of a company on whose board they sit will be looked at by their own board as what their compensation should be. And the single best predictor of what executive compensation will be is how many CEOs sit on the board. and particularly on the compensation committee. There are critics. Dr. Blair spoke less than admiringly of shareholder advocates, but there are shareholder advocates who argue that if boards were required to act on behalf of the shareholders, it would be a vast improvement in corporate governance. That actually corporate or executive compensation has now become a fairly significant part of overall net profit, of overall profitability, and in fact, even these massive pension funds can't get to 50% because 70 or 80% of stock is now legally held by someone who is not the beneficial owner. In other words, brokerage houses that hold the stock of shareholders who never see the piece of paper, never actually claim the legal title to the stock, but are the beneficial owner. And they vote for the incumbent or for the slate of corporate boards proposed by the incumbent directors, and California, North Carolina, UAW, any combination of pension funds can't outvote them. Dr. Blair, do you disagree with that critique, and why?
I think the critique,
I think you turned it off.
I think the critique has been taken way too far. Mm-hmm. I think it started out as a well-intentioned effort to try to make sure that corporate officers and corporate directors and managers were more accountable, but it's become an obsession and it's become an industry. The judge, Delaware judge I quoted was Vice Chancellor Leo Strine, there's over time we now have shareholder advisory firms, we have a substantial number of academics who are keenly interested in advocating in pushing a position in which we can create more and more control rights for shareholders. I think it's a very dangerous direction. I think that I personally don't think that Carl Icahn knows better about what Yahoo should do than Yahoo's executives do.
Dr. Gomory.
I think that you may have already made the point that I want to make, but I would like to clarify. My actual experience with boards and worrying about takeovers and things like that is the board of any significant corporation today knows there's a short list of people who control the shares. 14 in this company that I've dealt with, it's about 14, right? Almost all are, as you suggested, I think earlier, they're financial houses of one sort or another. So when we're talking about having shareholder control, people's minds go to people, individuals. Not so, folks. It's really the financial houses, all right? Now, putting more control in their hands is not at all necessarily a good idea.
Doesn't solve the principal agent problem at all.
When you say, are you talking about the brokerage houses that are voting shares that they are not for which they are not the beneficial owner?
Yes,
are you talking about pension funds?
Yes, exactly,
okay.
Exactly that. Yes, because you have to look at how those individuals are compensated in their financial firms, and if they are very sensitive, in hedge funds, it's terrible, of course, to the share price. All you're doing is making the company a more directly a financial object to be manipulated. You're not going to the people. You're going to the financial people and a small group of them.
There is a proposed rule for the New York Stock Exchange, I think I'm getting this right, that has been at the SEC for a year and a half, not acted upon. Are you familiar with that rule and that proposed rule? And it would limit what the legal owner of stock could vote on, even if it deprived the board or the shareholder meeting of a quorum for some issues, unless they had specific directions from the beneficial owners, which would essentially mean the brokerage houses couldn't vote for boards, board members, et cetera.
I am not, in answer to your question, I'm not aware of that, but I think it's an excellent direction.
Dr. Scott.
I have to disagree. If you go back to roughly 1960, the average share was held for somewhere between 6 and 8 years, and so it was reasonable to speak of somebody as having a long-term interest. Doesn't mean they know anything about the company, but at least with a 6 or 8 year holding, you're talking about somebody that has a long-term connection with the company. Average shareholding now is about 1 year. So when you're talking about shareholder and saying, does the shareholder have some kind of a long-term interest in the company, you have no way to have any bet on that at all. The change is we have, quote, democratized ownership, but we have also reduced the cost of trading. People are trading much more. I'm just go pick up the statement of any mutual fund and look and see what's the average turnover in their funds. And the average turnover on a whole lot of them is 2 times a year. Their real interest, and by the way, I think you're missing a term when you say it's brokerage houses. It's not brokerage houses. It's mutual funds and pension funds and insurance companies. And if you ask what's their big business is trying to attract additional assets that they manage. They don't want to antagonize any firm and at the risk of losing its pension fund business. So they don't even want to have to vote their shares. They don't want to have to vote anything that would be considered hostile to management. They're trying to grow assets under management at the mutual fund, the pension fund, or whatever else, not really worrying about how the company's managed.
I want to pursue that another time, I think. I think street name does not, stocks held in street name, which are 78% of stocks, are actually not stocks held by pension funds.
No, but your big holders are mutual funds.
Okay.
All right.
Dr. Gomory, obviously international trade affects American workers, but workers all over the world. And when I was considering the CAFTA vote, I was lobbied vigorously by advocates for human rights in the CAFTA countries who said it would actually be bad for the workers in those countries too, which is perhaps contrary to the common impressions of what the effect of trade is. What is the effect of free trade, international trade, unrestricted international trade on workers in other countries, and what has the effect been on the distribution of wealth in those countries?
Well, first of all, I would like to say this is not a subject on which I have deep knowledge. I mean, I've had an awful lot of experience in the U.S., but very limited in other countries. And I will simply report the impressions that I have from those who know more. And the impression that I have received is that the industrialization, the globalization has reinforced whatever the economic structure was in these countries. If you had a ruling elite, as you did in many, I'm not talking about China, of course, but take South American countries or others, that this has simply, they have been the principal gainers from globalization. So as I see that in the United States, the wealthy have been also. That pattern, I'm told, is repeated in other countries, but I am really relaying to you the opinions of others, not my own direct experience.
And Dr. Gomory, is there an economic benefit besides simply having a more fair society of having a more even distribution of wealth or income, and what is that benefit?
Well, if you, I mean, let's just stick to the United States, right? In the United States, we've had a productivity increase for 30 years, but people are, from the middle class on down, are struggling to pay their bills. And it's not that the productivity increase wasn't there, it's just they didn't get it. That's the downside.
Dr. Scott.
Yeah, I would answer that very differently, not in any way contradictory. It has a huge impact in the United States. We are almost alone in operating our educational system at the first 12 grades. We're almost alone in operating that on the market, and the market is local real estate taxes. You want to get a good school system, you now look and you say, who has the good school systems? It's the people that have the big tax base. The big tax base then is wealthy people, and they're attracting more and more, and we're getting segregation in schooling all over the country out of this. Other countries pay their school teachers typically either by a province or by a federal government. We're paying them by local real estate taxes, so as you build this, you're building a self-reinforcing thing. We no longer have mobility of the labor force that is greater than Europe. It's the other way around. So you're creating something where a whole lot of people are being deprived of the chance for a good education because they're in a school district that doesn't have the money to do it. And that's particularly what's going on around our big urban areas. So yes, it does. We're going to deprive all sorts of people of a good education as the wealth concentrates and people learn to buy their way into a place where you can get a good school.
Mr. Baird, do you wish to ask another round of questions?
Yeah, I would if I might.
All right, Mr. Baird.
Given that incredible amounts of money are available in state and federal pension funds, can you talk a little bit about constructive or counterproductive roles pension funds could play in some of the kind of reforms you've talked about?
Let me take that on. It's true that state and local pension funds have been among the most activists in the shareholder rights movement, if you want to call it that. And it does seem to me that that some of them have played some very constructive roles in almost in the behind-the-scenes conversations that they've had with corporate with companies than certainly then the rhetoric you see in the newspaper would tend to suggest. When General Motors was really in serious trouble in the 1980s, CalPERS, the California State Public Employees Retirement System, did some behind-the-scenes maneuvering along with a number of other institutional shareholders to pressure the board to change management and to make changes that needed to be made. And I certainly think that they have the potential to play a role in insisting on the overall performance of the company because they have a constituency that is in the state where they operate or in the community. So they ought to be paying attention to their beneficiaries as well as and to what's good for the beneficiaries as both in the financial terms and in the larger picture. Ironically, corporate pension funds are actually precluded from doing that because of a Department of Labor ruling that said that pension funds that are covered by or that are regulated under ERISA are required to pay attention to the interests to the financial interests only and not to pay attention to other interests that might affect the beneficiaries of those pensions. I mean, it's a kind of a perverse rule, but it was put in place in the 1980s, and I don't know that it's not a legislative. It's a as I understand it, it's a Department of Labor regulation rather than a statute. So the thing about pension funds is that they tend to have the most long-run interests because there's money flowing into pension funds that are to be held there for 10, 20, 30 years for the beneficiaries. And so they tend to have a more long-run focus. I don't think the problem is coming from pension funds, and I think they have a potential role that could actually be productive.
Let's look at a different, and you may have mentioned this already, so forgive me if I've done it, the role of hedge funds in this issue in either making the problem worse or possible ways they could improve it.
I'm not an expert on hedge funds, But one of the things that really troubles me about hedge funds is that they don't disclose anything. They're not required to disclose anything. So we don't know how their executives are being compensated. There's stories that that the hedge fund management gets 2% of the gross amount of money under management plus 20% of the profits. That produces some outrageous results in which they can, by taking very high-risk strategies, they can take off, they get their 2% every year, and then they can take off 20% when their strategy wins. They don't have to give any back when their strategy loses. And so they're in a heads I win, tails you lose situation. Now, what's puzzling to me is that the market hasn't regulated it, and I think the reason why the market hasn't regulated that so far is partly because they had a string of good years, and so it caused a lot of money managers to say, well, and even like private endowments say, well, let's put some of our money with these hedge funds. I would hope that in the wake of the financial crisis that has resulted from the mortgage lending and the securities that were based on mortgage lending, that you will see some of these institutions saying, oops, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Maybe we should not invest so much of our money with hedge funds. But I'm a strong believer in disclosure. I think if hedge funds had to disclose more of what they were doing, that they would then be subject to embarrassment. And I believe in embarrassment as a regulatory device.
Can I ask one other question, Mr. Chairman? Okay.
I'm sorry. If we could now, I thank all the witnesses in the first panel for their testimony. If we could now begin or have the testimony of the second panel, I think we will be called to votes before too much longer. And I'd like to see if we can get in the first round's testimony, the second panel's testimony. But thank all of you. Okay, can we just tell them that individually? Or? Thank you. I would now like to introduce our second panel. The first witness is Mr. James R. Copland III. Mr. Copland is the chairman of Copland Industries and Copland Fabrics located in Burlington, North Carolina. It is not in my long-term interest for all Americans to realize that some Southerners, when they act unsophisticated and guileless, actually have a pretty good idea of exactly what they're doing, and they may just be playing you. And I pointed out to Mr. Copland that I did know in the past, that he was a Moorhead Scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and son Jason, who now works in the family business, has a master's degree from the Amos Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. So I welcome Mr. Copland, and I hope you don't give our secret away. Second is Mr. Brian O'Shaughnessy, who's the chairman of the Revere Copper Products located in Rome, New York. And third, Mr. Wes Jurey, the president and CEO of the Arlington Chamber of Commerce in Arlington, Texas. Mr. Jurey, I'm sorry you did not get to meet your charming and capable member of Congress, Eddie Bernice Johnson, but you were lucky to have her. And now, all of you know that your oral testimony is limited to 5 minutes, and after that, the members of the committee will have the opportunity to ask rounds of questions. And again, to put you at ease, we'd like to put you under oath under penalties of perjury. Do any of you have an objection to being sworn in? No. And do any of you, are any of you represented by counsel? No. No. All right. If you now all stand and raise your right hand. Okay. And I understand Jason may also be testifying, so if you would stand as well. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Mr. Copland, you may begin.
Got this thing on first. Is it working now? There we go. First, thanks for the opportunity to speak before this esteemed committee. America needs a new manufacturing policy. I don't believe that anyone in America is opposed to free trade, as long as it's fair trade. But when foreign governments subsidize, manipulate their currency, flout legal requirements, and tactically condone worker and environmental abuses, it's impossible for Copland or any domestic manufacturer to compete. Under such circumstances, Copland isn't competing against foreign companies, but they're competing against foreign government. This is bad manufacturing policy. Let's look at the People's Republic of China. They are the 800-pound gorilla in international trade. As a communist country, most of China's industry is government-owned or quasi-government-owned. The Chinese government buys their capital equipment, or in the case of quasi-government-owned companies, it guarantees a purchase. Chinese companies often end up paying zero capital cost, a tremendous advantage that no U.S. competitor can overcome. In many cases, the Chinese government subsidizes utility and transportation costs, but that's not all. China also provides a 17% export subsidy on goods shipped to the United States when it fully rebates value-added taxes. China's currency is pegged to the dollar and is undervalued by approximately 40%. If our dollar goes down, the Chinese currency goes down. The yuan is not allowed to float on the world market like other currencies. This subsidy makes China's goods 40% cheaper in the market. Finally, China has no EPA, no OSHA, no workman's compensation, no unemployment insurance. Their whole system is different from ours, a communist system. Yet U.S. manufacturers must compete against them, an impossible task. People often talk about wage rates. Sure, China's wages are a mere fraction of ours, with no child labor laws, no overtime, few benefits. But let me be perfectly clear. Wages are not the only issue. U.S. workers are much more efficient. In many cases, if a Chinese company's labor costs were free, they still could not compete without subsidies from their government. U.S. manufacturers would win hands down. Absolutely no company can compete when your competition is a foreign government determined to spend whatever it takes to force you out of the market, and the U.S. government does nothing about it. The U.S. government recognized this problem with the communist Soviet Union, but for some reason it fails to see it with China. This is one of the things I mean when I say in my written testimony that the United States has an uncompetitive manufacturing policy. I also want to talk about one aspect of trade agreements that's not been given proper emphasis, the human factor. Millions of Americans are losing their jobs. Their jobs are being moved overseas and they can't get other jobs. Don't think there are high-tech jobs available for those folks, because there aren't. They're being shipped to China and India too. Moreover, many of the factory workers being laid off in the United States aren't trained for those jobs, even if they did exist. If those that were laid off are lucky, they've landed jobs flipping hamburgers or as a greeter at some retail store. Every American deserves the right to provide for his family, to own a home, and to educate his kids. But our flawed manufacturing and trade policies are taking this away. Our constitutional preamble says the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We've forgotten about the words, for the people. Go to the small towns in North and South Carolina. Mills are closed. Those stores are closed with weeds growing up around them. But you know it's really bad when you see the churches closing. Someone needs to think about the hard-working people and what's happening to them. They're left out of the thought process when flawed manufacturing and trade policy is made. Let me say that the big multinational companies, the importers, and big retailers have exactly what they want. They couldn't have written a book and had it more perfect for their world. Buy at the China price, sell at the U.S. price, and don't worry about whether the average American has a job or he can make ends meet. But their world is not what's good for America. You hear a lot of political candidates talking about the economy, our financial crisis, and health care. They talk about the result, but they don't talk about the cause. Subprime mortgages have been around for decades. Car loans, as long as there have been cars. Credit cards for decades. The primary reason people can't make their payments now is because they don't have any money. In most cases, the reason they don't have any money is because they've lost their jobs, or they now have jobs making a fraction of what their pay was before their jobs were exported. If these people had their manufacturing jobs, they wouldn't have the economic problems and financial problems we now have. People often got their health insurance from their jobs. Now many of those jobs have moved offshore because of our flawed trade agreements. No wonder we have a health care crisis. Americans just want their manufacturing jobs back. The U.S. government's policy is creating millions of jobs, all right, but they're creating them in the People's Republic of China and Vietnam at the expense of hard-working Americans here at home. Our country should be ashamed, totally ashamed of what our government has done to working people in America. People are angry now, and when they connect the dots, and they're going to connect them, they're going to know where to focus their anger.
Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My company is Revere Copper Products and was founded by Paul Revere in 1801. We believe we're the oldest manufacturing company in the USA. Our factory is in Rome, New York, and produces copper and brass sheet strip, coil, bar, and extruded products for shipment to other manufacturing companies. Revere is a domestic manufacturing company and outsources nothing. My unwillingness to outsource or sell out is based on loyalty and patriotism. Please note that I also represent and serve on the board of directors of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, or CPA. This coalition includes domestic manufacturing, organized labor, farming, and ranching. You should visit CPA at www.prosperousamerica.org. My testimony includes positions on issues that have not yet been considered by CPA, but are ever present in Revere's besieged financial results. Mr. Chairman, the U.S. is alone among major trading nations in the world without a national trade policy. China and the rest of the world are waging a mercantilist war on the U.S., and the U.S. is sleeping as its factories, farms, and ranches are being systematically destroyed. We desperately need a national trade policy instead of a patchwork of trade agreements that deepen the current problems and enable foreign protectionism. Our nation's focus on general trade agreements and FTAs is misguided, inadequate, and lacks strategic thinking. While I am a proponent of free trade, the agreements to date compound the problem while deceiving many who think free trade is being promoted. This is one problem that has real solutions. First, the USA cannot continue to negotiate global or bilateral trade agreements as long as the other country is free to manipulate its currency and use VATs to offset any tariff reduction. Also, labor, environmental, antitrust, quality, and intellectual and other property standards and trade agreements must be equivalent to the burden placed on manufacturing, farming, and ranching in the USA, or we just cannot compete and provide jobs in the USA. Can you imagine competing in a global market that gives your competition an 8-year head start? Yet that is exactly what is being proposed to kill jobs with House legislation for only domestic manufacturing companies to cap and trade and die. If the environmental burden is unfair for our foreign competition, it's unfair for us. In the global trade war, who do you represent? Second, the manipulation of its currency by China or any nation is unacceptable. The first step should be to pass the Ryan-Hunter bill, H.R. 2942, that would define currency manipulation as an illegal subsidy and allow the application of countervailing duties, CVDs, to offset the injurious impact of currency manipulation. The Ryan-Hunter bill is designed to sanction the use of CVDs to offset currency manipulation. We must assume that the system that governs world trade is broken and must be fixed immediately. If the use of CVDs to offset currency manipulation does not lead China to stop manipulating its currency, then the USA must take stronger measures, even if it means stepping outside WTO rules. Third, the USA must reform its tax and healthcare systems and institute VATs on a scale that gives production of goods and services in the USA a competitive advantage. Currently, the USA is the only country without such a policy. The USA must significantly reduce or eliminate all national taxes, both corporate and personal, including income, dividend, capital gain, estate, and FICA and unemployment taxes, and replace them with a consumption tax, like a VAT. Under current international trade rules, consumption taxes can be rebated on exports and imposed on imports. The USA refuses to reciprocate, disadvantaging all American-made goods that compete with imports or are offered for export. No wonder we have such a massive trade deficit. In my opinion, those taxes must also include the tax of healthcare costs. My concern is simply that healthcare cannot be paid for by job providers in the USA competing with job providers abroad who pay little, if any, health costs. Either the U.S. government solves this problem or outsourcing will resolve it. Fourth, the USA needs to ensure that its citizens and businesses have access to substantial additional low-cost clean energy so that they're able to compete on the world stage and keep the environment clean. Our government needs to focus on the big picture of global trade and the competitive position of the U.S. economy, which is deteriorating. Please address these problems with a national trade policy immediately. When Paul Revere tried to rouse the countryside with his wake-up call, what did the people do? They certainly didn't go back to sleep. We all need to wake up and listen, but we must be careful who we listen to. Visit reverecopper.com and learn more. Wake up, America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Jurey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the panel. I may bring a slightly different perspective than those who have testified before. As president of the El Paso, Texas Chamber during the 1990s, I was leading that chamber during a period when we lost 23,000 jobs in the garment industry, so I'm acutely aware of those issues, and yet many of the experiences there have led me to the things I'll share with you today. And at the end of that decade, we actually had more net employment in the county, despite the fact that we lost that many jobs. I then went to Arlington, Texas in 2001 and have led that chamber in the past nearly 7 years. Took that community from a time of economic stalemate to a time of robust growth in its tax base and jobs as well. And so I'll offer some thoughts from those perspectives. I would say at the outset that there are two factors that happened in the 1980s that we sometimes overlook, and that was that the Cold War ended. We asked Premier Gorbachev to tear down the wall, and the unintended consequence was we put 3 billion people into competition with us in the world's marketplace, and we're not going to turn that clock back. And we invented the Internet and the federal labs, and we gave people the ability with the click of a mouse to move CAD drawings and X-rays worldwide, and we're not going to close that door again either. And so the reality is we are in a truly globally driven, innovation-driven economy, And the critical issue is, how do we maintain U.S. competitiveness? And from my experience, these companies have two critical factors they have to think about. Do they have access to a highly trained, skilled, competitive workforce? And what is the true cost of doing business in the area they're at? Often derived from various factors, including things like whether we tax consumption, production, or wealth, and as well as what kind of regulatory climate and processes are they competing with in that climate. And so I'll offer 5 brief suggestions. Number 1, if you look at the publicly funded workforce system, it's not that you need more dollars, it's that we need to think very carefully about how we both allocate and deploy the dollars that you do spend. And I would say that at the outset, if you look at the Workforce Investment Act, it's written from a job seeker perspective, not an employer or job creator perspective. And therein lies your challenge. We're currently managing a grant for the Texas Workforce Commission. It's a modest grant of $1 million, and the goal is to create replicable, sustainable, scalable models of how we engage the systems to work together to provide workers for advanced manufacturers. I'll give you some simple examples. National Semiconductors spent $50 million retooling a plant to go from a 6 to an 8-inch wafer to remain competitive in the U.S., finding no curriculum to retrain their staff with. We're putting modest sums of money into National Semiconductor, our community college, and our university. They're cataloging training National Semi is having to develop. The outcome will be curriculum that can be employed in the future at a fraction of the cost of National Semi. Second quick example is Progressive, a company building a part for Lockheed Martin for the Joint Strike Fighter. Can't find the 7 machinists it needs today, let alone the 400 it will need in the future. There are hundreds of unemployed machinists in Michigan, but the Texas Workforce Commission can't spend $1 letting them know these jobs exist. And there's little training capacity in Texas. And so we're putting dollars into the Dallas and Tarrant County college systems to create that capacity. And the commonality of many examples I could cite for you is that under current DOL WEIR regulations, the ways we're deploying and allocating these dollars would be exceedingly difficult to do under those regulations. And my bottom line recommendation, and there are many in my written testimony, is a really thoughtful look at both the process and the measures would help those dollars be spent far more effectively to address many of the workforce needs and the challenges that these employers face. Secondly, to recognize that if we need highly skilled workers to drive a highly innovative economy, that if you look at the graduate and postgraduate programs in the United States, 50% of those students are either immigrants or they're foreign students. 40% of all PhDs granted in 2006 went to those foreign students or immigrants, and 75% of those PhDs will go to foreign students or immigrants in 2010. We have an incubator in Arlington. We started it with the university in 2002. In the past 6 years, more than 75% of all the intellectual discoveries and innovative ideas coming to us came from foreign students and immigrants. And the bottom line is they can either go home and take that innovation with them, or we can find ways to both protect our borders and welcome legal immigrants and keep the innovation in the United States. Third, federal R&D funding. Talks with Dr. Zerhini at the National Institutes of Health, I commend him because under translational awards called roadmaps sometimes, he's recognized that if he takes some of the $27 billion NIH uses to fund health research and puts it into the hands of universities that partner with the private sector in a genuine collaborative environment, that the commercialization activity resulting then takes place in the U.S., not foreign countries. And if you look at what they're doing in Homeland Security and the Science and Technology Directorate, they've funded 6 major research projects to date, all through major universities, all required to collaborate with 20 to 30 other partners, both private sector and nonprofit and other universities. And I would commend you to those models because they take federal R&D dollars, they leverage private sector and university dollars, and they ensure that commercialization takes place in the United States. And if you look carefully at Northern California from the 40s and 50s on, it's frankly how they became Silicon Valley. Fourth, promote global cooperation in the international tax arena. As was cited, foreign countries do many things with their currency and their taxation, but the reality is we've got to go back to looking at the factors that drive U.S. competitiveness. And a part of it is taxation. Are we taxing production, wealth, or consumption? What does that do in the regulatory environment, and how does that impact cost structure? Remember Reynolds aluminum plant in Arkansas in the 1980s. They paid high wages, $25 to $45 an hour in 1984, but their cost was the cost of electricity. They paid $100 million a year to Arkansas Power and Light for electricity. And the rumor started that they were going to move and go to another city in another state. And everybody scoffed at the idea because they just built the $42 million plant. Plant manager put it in perspective. He said, Wes, if you pass second grade math, you'll understand that if a city offers me that utility kilowatt hourage at $60 million a year, in 3 years I'll net $80 million to the bottom line in a highly competitive industry while abandoning that plant to your industrial development corporation and building a new plant in the other city. And so although we can say we kept those jobs in America, that was little consolation for the people in Hot Springs and Malvern, Arkansas, who lost their jobs, the city and county who lost the tax pay, and the $100 million hole left in the rate base of Arkansas Power and Light. And so it really is critical to think about the cost factors of those companies and how, if we think globally and talk about the international tax arena, that could be an area where the United States leadership could be impactful. And fifth, focus on the prevention of harmful regulatory competition internationally. Use our economic international diplomacy in those arenas. Imagine if the General Motors plant in Arlington, Texas, that brings in components from over 600 suppliers throughout the United States, imposed tariffs on all of those supplies. Well, the truth is the United States economy is strong because interstate commerce is regulated in a way that allows that trade to flow among and between the 50 states. In a global competition, we're going to have to find ways for that trade to flow fairly throughout the countries of the world because, again, we're not going to be able to turn the clock back. I'd say in summation that the number one most vital recommendation I have is that our economic policy promote globalization. For 60 years, we told foreign countries to open their markets, and for the last 20 years, they finally did. And that coincides with a time of economic prosperity in the United States. We've got to recognize, too, that 96% of the world's consumers live in another country. We've grown because we were a land of immigrants, and we fed on their hunger and their energy and their innovation, and we've become one of the most open, competitive societies in the world. And I close by leaving you with this thought. Dr. George Kosmetsky, considered one of the pioneers and founders of Silicon Valley, published an extensive demographic analysis in 2000, going back to 1950 and forward to 2050. And he said, on giving me a copy, we're living in a time when 88% of the wealth is controlled by 12% of the people in countries all demographically projected to decline through 2050, meaning 12% of the world's population, 12% of the world's wealth is what 88% of the world's people try to survive on, all in countries demographically projected to grow for the next 50 years. What do you think that means, he said. And my comment was I'd much rather understand what he thought, and he said, I think it's simple. Global competition will cause us to finally go to war over resources or learn to integrate the global economy so that every nation has a stake in a strong global economy in which the United States can remain competitive. I appreciate the time given to me to speak to the panel.
I want to thank all the panelists. We were just called for a vote. I suppose, Mr. Baird, what is your schedule? Well, we've now had proposals that are out of the usual mainstream political debate to the left and out of the mainstream political debate to the right. So we wanted a open discussion of ideas that aren't part of the usual debate, and we certainly have had that. I will waive my first round and recognize Mr. Baird. Do you have questions? Oh,
first panel back up.
Oh, one second, please. All right.
Get back.
For now, Mr. Baird.
I thank the panelists. I thought all of the comments were very insightful, and appreciate the struggles, particularly Mr. Copland and Mr. Shaughnessy, as you try to meet the challenges of keeping domestic workforce and industry viable. One could say that Mr. Jurey's comments were contradictory to Mr. Copland and O'Shaughnessy. I don't necessarily see it so. As I listened, it sounded to me like Mr. Jurey was saying, look, if we blame it all on trade, we're missing a whole lot of other things we could be doing to make ourselves more competitive. What as the three of you listen to each other, what are the areas of common ground that you heard in one another's testimony?
Well, I'll start. One of the things that I'll acknowledge quickly is they both face intense competitive pressures. And many of the regulatory policies of the United States don't necessarily help them. And then there's a reality. We have a company that I didn't talk about, Progressive to an extent, the one trying to find the machinists. They're paying $86,000 a year to a starting machinist. They'll quickly get them to $106,000. And when they get them trained to that level, their competition comes in, gives them a signing bonus, a higher salary, and takes them away. And their comment was, we want, as good corporate citizens, to keep these jobs and this work in the United States. But if you continue to not be capable of producing the machinists we need and the wages continue to escalate, there will come a time when even that enhanced U.S. productivity per worker will meet a certain mark, and I'm going to have to be forced to do something different to remain competitive. And so again, if you look at the way we spend dollars, you've got an apprentice program at the Department of Labor that has almost no money to spend, and yet the minute you put people in an apprenticeship program, they start getting industry wages. There's a great return on the dollar spent to assist industry with the cost of getting highly trained, competitive people who can create that level of productivity.
Mr. Jurey, what you're saying is music to my ears. I founded the Career and Technical Education Caucus in the Congress. I just would ask you to not repeat this in front of our staff,
okay,
lest we lose a number of fine young people to career and technical fields like machinists because they'll make more money doing what they do there than they do here.
Well, every time I've announced that salary, people come up and give me cards and say, tell me where to apply, and the reality is that's where the job market's going, and we do need to think differently about how the United States supports industries like the two on the panel with me. I simply think you also have to take into account the fact that we are forced to compete in a global economy, and pretending otherwise won't make a difference, won't change that.
Thank you. Mr. O'Shaughnessy or Mr. Copland, any comments?
I think job training is an important factor, but I think it comes after some of the basics, and the basics start with your costs and the cost of your competitor. And if currency manipulation has an impact of 40% on your costs, and value-added taxes has an impact, an average worldwide of 18%, but put them all together about 20%. That's 60%, those two. If healthcare costs, they're 10% of Revere's costs, now you're up to 70%.
It's a tough margin to beat.
Doesn't really matter whether there's anyone trained or not. We're out of business. And now we're going to increase the energy costs by probably 30% in this country, but not in others.
Is it your feeling, Mr. O'Shaughnessy, that the things, or the other panelists, that the issues you've just addressed are not adequately dealt with in our trade negotiations?
Sir, they are not dealt with, period, in our trade negotiations.
Any dispute of that? Or
No, see, I'd concur with that again. I made 2 points. It's a competitive workforce, and it's the total cost of doing business environment they have to compete in. And that is a legitimate part of that total cost of doing business. So if you go back to one of his comments about consumption tax, look at the taxation factors that really are a part of the cost of doing business. If you're taking a company that has high capital cost, and your tax environment primarily taxes wealth or capital investment, then that's a disincentive to that company. On the other hand, if a company's costs are primarily in production and you've levied a high production cost, you've handicapped their competitiveness. And so if you don't think about tax policy as it impacts their cost of doing business, and then if you don't think about the tax policy internationally that either helps or hinders the global competition, then we aren't going to be able to enable the kind of true competition we need for the U.S. companies to remain competitive.
I actually concur with both points, and one of the frustrations I have about our trade policy, and I spoke with Susan Schwab about this a few days ago and spoke with members from the Machinists Union just yesterday, is we tend to battle it out over yes or no Colombia, yes or no Peru, yes or no Panama, but we neglect all these other structural factors of our own society, and the focus so becomes on the trade agreement, yes or no, that we neglect our tax policy, our education policy, our currency policies, et cetera. And I think ultimately to solve this, and whoever the next president is, be Democrat or Republican, we're not going to solve this country's financial situation unless we take a comprehensive, integrated approach. And by the way, the president doesn't write the laws, this body does, so we can look to that president, but the fact is it's the next Congress that needs to address a comprehensive approach, not just to trade policy, but to economic policy writ large, and I very much value the insights of the gentleman. Yield back to them.
Thank you. Well, the buzzers that you heard earlier were Mr. Baird and I Mr. Baird and me being called to a vote, and we now need to go vote. It'll probably take us 20 minutes, perhaps a half an hour. What's that? There will be 3 votes. And so if you all could be at ease for a little bit, we will vote and come back and reconvene. Thank you.
I may not be able to return, but I'm very grateful to both panels for their insightful testimony. Thank you very much.
We're back.
Hey, can you? Some in my briefcase.
I think there are barely enough chairs for all of this.
My students would be. But they can understand.
I think we are probably close to the end of the hearing. I apologize for making all of you wait so long for so close to the end of the hearing. I do have a couple of questions for various members of the 2 panels. Most antitrust laws are designed to keep prices low. An exception to that I remember from law school and from the early years of my practice when I actually did a little of that was predatory pricing, which is where a large company set prices that were below cost, below their cost, certain in the knowledge that they could outlast their smaller competitors. And when those companies went out of business, the smaller competitors went out of business, they would be able to set their prices at whatever level they wanted to, or whatever the monopoly price would be rather than the competitive price would be. A lot of the economists point out, those who are strong advocates for free trade, not apostates, argue that a lot of the benefits that Mr. Copland described and Mr. O'Shaughnessy described and others of you as well that the Chinese have in particular, the currency manipulation, free capital, getting a free land, free building, free machinery, all that's free capital, is actually a cost, and they are selling to us below cost, below what it costs their society. At least, and that if a country wants to sell us goods at below cost, we ought to let them. That's a bargain for as long as it lasts. That eventually they'll have to raise their prices. Mr. Copland, when the day comes and the Chinese correct or let their currency float and stop giving free capital to Chinese textile manufacturers, are you going to be in business?
First off, are you going to guarantee that they're going to they're going to change their currency policy and they're going to change this stuff you're talking about?
Well, if they do.
If they do.
Are you sure?
Are we going to be in business? Well, let me tell you, it's been extremely difficult. It's been like a nightmare what we've had to face. Our business was the curtain business. We were the big player in the United States for it. And actually, we had an extremely high market share because we were the best. That's why we had that market. And they came at this market starting in 2001. China had about 7% of the import market, and the total import market on our goods was only about 5%. What's happened in that 7-year period is China's imports went up 6,900% on the type of goods that we made. China has got 90+% market share. Let me tell you something. The total market today is offshore goods. The total market today is 98% offshore goods. So what do we have to do? I mean, what we're doing, that market's gone. They're selling this stuff below, not below cost, they're selling it below our raw material cost to be able to do it. This is the subsidies that you're talking about. This is the predatory pricing that you're talking about. How do we survive? It's just a sad way to have to survive. We're picking up the pieces when somebody else goes out of business. We have competition go out of business. We pick up a piece. And believe you me, just as soon as you get into it, here come the Chinese again. We look constantly for something that the Chinese are not doing, that they haven't focused on yet, or we're looking constantly for something that may have some natural barrier to them coming over here, a time thing or so on. But remember, everybody in our industry is doing the same thing. Everybody. There have been 550,000 jobs lost in my industry since 2001 alone. Manufacturing in my state, North Carolina, has lost 28% of the manufacturing jobs. We've lost 19% nationwide, folks. Now you ask, are we going to be able to do it? With every ounce of energy I've got, with every ounce of energy that my son's got, and our wonderful workforce, loyal workforce we got, we intend to do it. We intend to be here. But I'm going to tell you that if this thing doesn't stop, there's going to be no survivors that have manufacturing in the United States. And I will not put my manufacturing in the People's Republic of China. I will not put it in any foreign country. I have loyal workforce. They're part of my family. I speak of them as though they're part of my family. And I will tell you, under no circumstances will I export their jobs, will I put them out of work for my own personal gain. But I intend to, if Lord gives us the strength and we get any decent break at all, we'll make it.
Anyone else? Dr. Gomory.
Yes, I want to talk to the notion that when they have wiped out the competition and then they raise their prices, that you can get back in. I mean, that may be some form of economics, but it's not the real world. In any business, even low-tech or high-tech, there's an immense amount of know-how. And when you lose the know-how, you're out of it. You're also not an isolated thing. You depend on a chain of people who get parts for you, and they're not there anymore. And the idea that when the other guy is finished killing you, you can rise from the dead, that's on paper. But in the real world, it's complicated. You're very dependent on things that have gone away. You can't do it.
Okay. Dr. Scott.
Well, listening to Mr. Copland, it really strikes me that there's a certain measure of discretion that people have when they're running a company. He could have changed his mind and said, guys, I'm in the nickel and dime business, shut the business. All right? There aren't very many people like Mr. Copland any longer. One of the reasons is what's taught in business education across the entire country has changed, and that also changes beginning at the end of the 70s or the beginning of the 80s. Just pick one, that's the one that I happen to know. But our school was founded, the dean said, the mission of the school is to teach people to earn a decent profit in a decent way. That's a question, it's not an answer, but it says business schools don't do that anymore. And the change, the teaching the decent profit in a decent way, you could pass for saying we're going to teach officers that have some loyalty to a broad range of things. We start doing the other, and what we're doing is teaching mercenaries. We're teaching mercenaries. No mercenary is going to pay attention to his concerns at all. And they're going all through the establishment with a new calculus that says, hey, in order to be effective, you got to be able to reduce it to one dimension where you can tell that 3 is bigger than 2. The sense of responsibility that ought to be there isn't there. And we're generating them. I'm sure that this is an exception where they don't do that, but aside from Vanderbilt, it's all over the country.
Let me make, excuse me, you three. Let me make another statement about this in regard to what was said just a minute ago. Mr. Chairman, you said whenever they get enough and they're going to raise their prices. This business is not going to come back to America. Let me tell you about the textile business. When these plants are closed down, they're closed. The equipment, if you don't run the equipment, keep it up, it deteriorates nothing anyway. But the equipment's being sold. Pakistan's buying equipment. People are getting it, selling it for 5 cents on the dollar. Nobody wants it. And let me tell you what's happening to the buildings themselves. I was just down in Joanna, South Carolina. A huge mill down there. It's been closed 5 years. They're tearing it down. They're doing it all over the South, tearing the mills down that are closed. Why? They're going to sell the bricks, guys. They're going to sell the beams. They'll sell the bricks and sell the beams. So don't think that you're going to be able to say, oh, boy, as soon as this thing's over, here we come back, it's going to be a regeneration. All we're trying to do is to hold on to what we've got. And if we don't wake up and start paying attention to these trade agreements that we are making and pay attention to the fine points of these trade agreements, we're going to give it all away. Let me give you one example. We just talked about CAFTA, and that's not too long ago, CAFTA. Sound like a good idea. All right, going to make it in the United States, going to make it in Central America, everybody's going to be okay. But they left a loophole. The loopholes is what gets us. And so many times our negotiators don't even know that the loopholes are there because there's some political appointee that hadn't done it for about 6 months or 3 months, or they've been out of college for about a year. They don't even know the loopholes are there. If they do know and they do it, woe be to them. But let me tell you something. They had a deal in there to where they could take pocketing. So that doesn't sound like much. That's not sound like much. Let me tell you something. Pocketing is a 180 million yard business in the United States. Pockets for trousers. It's a U.S. business. And they had it in there and said, well, you know, we're going to make an exception on pocketing, and we're going to let these Central American countries make this stuff out of Chinese cloth. Dominican Republic wanted that. They gave it to them. We pointed it out. We said, look, you're going to destroy the industry. Oh, no. Oh, don't worry. We're going to fix it. We're going to fix it. We're going to fix it. Trust us. We're going to fix it. That was 3+ years ago, folks. It hadn't been fixed. There's been nothing done. And let me tell you the result of that thing. 80% of that market's gone. And it's gone, folks. 80% of it's gone. Haynes Dining Finishing Company in Winston-Salem closed down 75% of their business. Closed it down. They've been there longer than we have. Alice Manufacturing Company closed down 4 plants down in South Carolina. You've got Mount Vernon. They lost 70 million yards worth of business. Closed plants in Rome, Georgia. Closed plants down in Texas. We've got to start paying attention to what we're doing with these trade agreements. We've got to get some people that know what they're doing with these trade agreements. We're being out negotiated. We better start paying attention to what we're doing. Because let me tell you something, we're exporting the wealth of this country as fast as we can export it today. It's going offshore. We're going to pay one tremendous price in this country.
Dr. Gomory.
I really want to comment on that because, first of all, I'm in wholehearted agreement. But I think it's very difficult to work out a set of agreements which are that detailed. It's also very difficult to counter the next mercantilist policy, which may be loophole 47, all right? The reason why I think we should seriously consider the Buffett Certificate Program is because it measures results, not how you got them. The Buffett proposal, if you can't export, they can't import, okay? However tricky they are and whatever the deals are. Right? It's not trying to match, their currency manipulation with our currency manipulation, or their loophole with our loophole, or their subsidy with our subsidy. It says, okay, kids, if you want to ship stuff in, we've got to be shipping stuff out, and it's not on a nation-by-nation. This, I think, is an approach which needs to be taken very, very seriously.
Mr. Shaughnessy.
I have two problems with the free trade, or with trade agreements in general that we've negotiated. The first is trade agreements are designed to lower taxes, to lower tariffs. That's what they're about. But the problem is, because of our tax system, where we are the only country, the only major country in the world that does not have VAT taxes, VAT taxes are like a tariff, but they're exempt from trade agreements. They're exempt by WTO rules. And so what happens is that, and you could look at a chart, it's in my written testimony, about how European countries have lowered tariffs, the normal tariffs, and they've increased VAT taxes, and their total tariffs are the same. So they don't even work on that side. The second problem I have with the free trade agreements is that the focus is wrong. And you see, to put together a patchwork of trade agreements to solve our trade policy, to solve the loss of the manufacturing jobs, and the loss that we're going to see in the service sector, that's it. We're going to lose way more jobs in the service sector than we've lost in the manufacturing sector. We have to design a national trade strategy or policy from the top so that when we consider things like environmental standards, we think about the impact on our own ability to produce goods and services. When we consider energy policy, we'll think about that. When we consider tax policy, we'll think about that. And when you layer all of these things together, that's very critical. That's what's wrong. Our focus is wrong by looking at trade agreements without having the framework to negotiate them from.
Let me just say this about the tariffs, and he brought up about the tariffs. We make these trade agreements, and today the average tariff in the United States, this is the average of the tariffs, United States tariffs, 1.7%. That's not much, guys. You turn right around and you look at the tariffs that the other countries have, that we have these agreements with, and they average 30%. Is that fair? Is that a good deal when you negotiate something like that? No, you can't tell me it is. Let me tell you something. China today, they have, under the rules, they have the right to designate themselves as an underdeveloped country. China, they got the biggest international trade in the world. But when you're designated as an underdeveloped country, you can charge anything you want as far as tariffs on stuff coming in there, in addition to these value-added taxes like that's been brought up. Is that fair? Is that good negotiations? Are those good trade deals? Is that good for America? Absolutely not.
Jurey.
Make sure this is on. I guess a point I would make, a lot of good comments have been made, but I would encourage the panel, the commission, the committee to think this way. There's going to have to be a comprehensive solution. It's not as simplistic as taking any one of these suggestions. At one point, I remember a key member of your staff said, well, could you cite in your testimony what specific clause we could change to deal with your point? And I said, I wish it were that simple. I wish I could say that if you simply change Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph 9 under WIA, all these things would go away. But the reality is the entire law is structured in such a way that you're going to have to rethink all of the processes and all of the measurements and how they impact the competitiveness of all these companies. And in a similar way, you're going to have to think about the broader aspects of these free trade agreements, because there are components that challenge the men at this podium, but you can't simply take one component and change it and think you've solved the problem. The broader issue really is we don't have a comprehensive economic policy to deal with global competitiveness. It's got to be multifaceted, and there are some aspects of global competition we're not going to be able to change, and there are others we can. And if out of this you can begin to think about the things that you can impact, and as one of your colleagues said, you're the group that writes the laws, if you can pull out the parts that you can have an impact on and look at it in a more comprehensive way, I believe you could make significant progress in enabling these companies to remain and be very globally competitive.
Dr. Scott.
The trade ideas are the same as the one for the domestic. And the fundamental change, by the way, the increasing inequality in the United States comes after 1980. And if you say from 1945 to 1980, the fraction of the income being earned by the top 10% in the United States does not change for 35 years. Change is since 1980, 1982. By the same token, this is not coming from globalization. Europeans are not experiencing the same kind of increase in inequality at all that we are. It's here. It's since 1980. And we're very close to being back to the income distribution that we had at the end of the 1920s. The common denominator is we have deregulated domestically at the same time that we're trying to deregulate, and the universal principle has been deregulate. And I say, it's like my little green box. It's exactly the same thing. Hey, fellas, we really don't need to regulate. We can use the common resources without really having to figure out what we're going to do. It'll solve itself automatically. Well, it isn't, and it won't as you do this. But that's a very big job, because you'll find that being taught not in the business schools, but at the economics departments in this country, everywhere. All right? It's very, very different when you get to Europe. My big personal luck was somebody that's a publisher in Germany happened to call and say, are you publishing a book? Tell me about it, and so on like that, and say, hey, we'll publish it. Right? Because they really teach economics that's grounded in history in Europe, in Germany, in France, and in Scandinavia. We don't.
The other Mr. Copland, Jason Copland.
I wanted to expand upon and agree with Mr. Jurey's comments just about the whole need for a comprehensive trade policy. Just something that's going on real and right now that I thought that it would be interesting to hear about, Chairman Miller, is the recent Farm Bill. And I want to give a very concrete example. We've had kind of a disjointed trade policy where sometimes we sign free trade agreements with countries for political reasons, or sometimes reasons I can't even figure out, other than the fact that maybe we just want to sign as many free trade agreements as possible. But then sometimes we also try to create these regional trading blocks. And that was really the intent behind NAFTA and CAFTA, was that we would be able to use our technology and our productivity and then utilize other countries' less expensive labor. And then you would have that rising economic tide that would both help the United States and Mexico and our Central American partners. Well, in the most recent Farm Bill, Charlie Rangel put out a Haiti add-on to that Farm Bill, where it kind of destroys that entire concept in North America, where we're going to have a trade bill with Haiti that's part of the Farm Bill that will allow, just specifically with textiles, it will have absolutely no rules or regulations whatsoever, and it will allow fabrics to come in not just from the regional trading bloc, but from China. And no one, and it is so sad that the economic condition that Haiti is in, but this just shows the lack of any type of a comprehensive trade policy, and no one has thought that through. Well, if Haiti has that, well, what is that going to do to the Dominican Republic? And what is that going to do to Guatemala and Nicaragua? No one thinks about that at all. And who it really is going to help is the Chinese. And it's really, too many people want to blame China, and this is just an overall criticism of Washington, D.C. People like to point the fingers at China. And I think that that's wrong. I think we should be pointing the fingers at ourselves. It's not China's fault. It's our fault because we've let it happen.
Okay. The answers to my only question so far have taken 20 minutes. And I'm not sure how important my questions are into this discussion now. We are close to the end. Obviously not solving all the problems of the world or of this problem, but of the hearing at least. And we will have further hearings on this topic. I know that some of the first panel in the discussion of corporate governance talked about a model of corporate governance in which the corporation was not driven entirely by profitability, but by other considerations, and that a corporate board of directors could decide to locate manufacturing operations in the United States, even if they would be cheaper somewhere else, because of the effect on the community and the effect of their employees and out of loyalty to their employees, and that the law should allow and even encourage that. But I wonder how well that generous impulse is going to work in guiding corporate behavior for the longer term, although perhaps you're right, there have been more generous impulses in the past than there have been recently. I would like to hear a little bit about some of the other things we could do besides having more generous impulses guide boards of directors. And one that I have worked on a fair amount, or talked about a fair amount, is the need for training for workers to learn new skills very quickly. That we should have an advantage on the rest of the world in the ability to learn new skills quickly as manufacturing operations change fairly quickly. I visited Mr. Copland's plant. If you've seen the movie Normal Ray, it doesn't look much like that. We are developing new technologies quickly. I think one of the first panel's discussions of R&D being an advantage is only an advantage if it's just R&D. If that's the only thing happening in the United States, it's not all that helpful. What we hope happens is R&D is applied in the United States at least first. At least for a while we'll have a head start, and that our workforce needs to be able to learn the skills quickly to use new technologies. I attended a panel discussion earlier this week organized by the Business Roundtable. They don't invite me to talk about executive compensation, but they did invite me to talk about community colleges. Mr. Copland knows the role that both Mr. Coplands know the role that community colleges play in North Carolina, and perhaps don't know how much better, how much more of an advantage it is to North Carolina business than in other parts of the country. Other parts of the country, community colleges began as academic institutions, as essentially a junior college. And in North Carolina, they've always been technical, job skills driven, and there is a close relationship between the business community, business leadership, and the community colleges to develop curricula for specific job skills. The leading employer in Alamance County is no longer Mr. Copland's company or Glen Raven Mills or Burlington. It is LabCorp, the nation's second largest medical testing firm. And Alamance Community College has a curriculum in testing, in medical testing, developed in consultation with LabCorp, and LabCorp hires every one of the graduates of that program, at least the ones who don't take another job with somebody else that can actually get a better deal out of it. Mr. Jurey, what is the role of community colleges or job training in our ability to compete and keep jobs in this country?
I think it's critical. And I'll give you one clear anecdote that speaks to what you've said about community colleges. In the mid-90s, I was in El Paso. The Texas Workforce Commission committed considerable dollars. Every hospital committed considerable dollars to that community college to expand the only nursing program within 200 miles. We had 12% unemployment. We had hospital CEOs going to India and China to recruit nurses, and finally persuaded the board to go along with the need to expand a program with 200 on its waiting list. Along came a new college president who called me and said, I've decided we're going to open a beauty college and put a hold on the nursing expansion. And when I got up off the floor, I said, could you tell me why? There are 6 for-profit beauty colleges in our community. None have a waiting list. They pay below median wage. Nursing pays a very high above median wage. It's a huge demand, and your taxpayer supported, and we thought you were going to meet the demand needs of industry. And he still was unwilling to bend, and so I said, fine, went back and talked to my board, and they said, you're going to organize a tax rollback election, since he also announced something like a 30% tax increase. The next day, the College Board of Trustees chair called me and said, I thought we were partners. I said, so did I. But all we ever asked you to do was listen to the actual needs of the employers, and you've quit doing that. He quickly called the board together in closed session, asked me to recite my discussion with the college president. At the end of it, he looked at the board, and they nodded, and he said, can we have 24 hours to reason with our new president? I said, well, yes, sir. He called me the next day and said, after reasoning with him, he's resigned. Can you get that money back on the table? Now, to me, that's a very responsive community college system, because the Board of Trustees took seriously their need to think about the role they played in providing the kind of training necessary to keep key sectors competitive. But then if you back up into the regulatory process side I discussed, and you start really digging deeply into how quickly can local workforce boards and community colleges deploy WIA and DOL dollars to meet those needs, when employers are faced with having to get speed to market and rapid response to changing market conditions, it's extremely cumbersome. It's very difficult to do outside of the box. It's hard to help employers retrain incumbent workers to get higher skills to quickly meet those changed needs, because the slant in the law is toward entry-level job seekers. And yet, if you don't move incumbent workers up the ladder, there are no entry-level jobs for the job seekers to seek. And so again, I keep trying to stress, you're going to have to think a little more comprehensively if you really want to help all these companies remain competitive, and think about the impact not just of one change, but to how systemically we can provide the type of incentives and assistance and help, particularly in having a highly competitive trained workforce, that these employers need. And one last comment, if they need apprenticeships, there's no dollars to pay them in the program.
Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to catch a flight, so I'd like to comment. Thank you. I think the issue of education training is a very important one. However, I think it's necessary to put it in perspective. I often read articles about we need to encourage more of our young people to study engineering. The way we're going, it really isn't going to matter, because there's not going to be anywhere for them to work that needs that kind of work. The factories are going to be shut down. The service jobs are going overseas because of factors like 40% of our costs, currency manipulation, 20% taxes, 10% health care. That's 70%. If you don't deal with those issues, and then we add on energy costs, another 10, environmental costs, another 10, we've got a 90% cost problem. I want to solve those problems so that we have jobs for well-trained people. And to train people when they lose jobs, to focus on that, well, I don't know where they're going to go. I think we're in a much more serious problem than any of us realize, and we won't realize it until the service jobs start flowing overseas. As Alan Blinder, the former vice chairman you quoted, he also said that he expected to see 30 million service jobs go overseas in the next few years.
Gomory.
I'd like to go back to your point that what we were saying about corporate governance. By the way, I'm very supportive. We've done a great deal of work on community colleges. I think they're vital, great training grounds. Sometimes they're confused about whether they're places to train people for higher education or for jobs, but
they do some of both.
Is jobs.
Yeah.
But I think in the corporate governance, we certainly mentioned liberating directors to consider more than profit. But I also think we should seriously entertain the notion of rewarding companies that create and keep high-value jobs in the U.S. So that when they have this generous impulse to locate the jobs here, hey, they're doing a service to the country. They're adding to our GDP. Let's give them something for doing that. That's what all the other countries do. They say, come here, add to our GDP. We'll give you profit in return. Why can't we say that too? Right? And that's why I suggest just one example, a corporate income tax graded by the value add of the people in the company. But there are other ways. Right? I think we have to realize that when companies create jobs here, and especially those that are productive, they are already doing a service for the country before they pay their tax. Right? And we need to take that into account.
I'd support that in this way. The market responds to incentives, and if you can think about how to incentivize those kinds of behaviors in ways that also enable companies to be highly cost competitive, that can be very effective as part of a strategy.
Fred, as far as
I almost said that I wanted the record to reflect that I'd asked a question and no one named Copland had raised their hand to respond. But
I'll say something.
Mr. Copland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, let me say that as far as job retraining and education, I am totally in favor of it. It's a wonderful thing. And we do, in the state of North Carolina, have a tremendously successful community college system. But it can only go so far. Only go so far. You talked about my county of Alamance County and LabCorp, and what the chairman said is true. But we've had 40% of the people in my county, 40% of the manufacturing jobs been lost. LabCorp can't hire all those people. LabCorp hires them, but they can't hire all those people at all. Only a fraction are they able to hire. And if you look right down the road to Cabarrus County, North Carolina, down Cannon Mills, Pilatex. What was it, 4 years ago? They went out, 5,000 people lost their job all at one time. Today, only 60% of those people have found any job at all. And they've got a wonderful community college system. So there's got to be a blend. You've got to have both. You've got to take into consideration everything, and job retraining and education is part of the answer, but it needs to be a comprehensive program that has been brought out here today.
I think I've been called for another vote. And I think we are probably at the end of the hearing. I encourage all of you to keep talking among yourselves. When you get it all worked out, I'll introduce the bill that solves all the problems.
Do you promise?
I really want to thank all of you who organized this. I think it's been a very worthwhile thing, and we're talking about some things you don't get to talk about everywhere. Right. I appreciate it.
Well, it's obviously, these are topics that we need to talk about more. I want to thank all the panelists for appearing, including Mr. O'Shaughnessy, who's had to leave now to go get on a plane. But thank all of you, and I appreciate all of the perspectives that are not typically part of this debate, but perhaps given the consequences of this debate, we need to step back and think about whether some of the assumptions that have gone unchallenged should be challenged. So again, thank you for appearing, and we are now adjourned. Thank you.